For 3 years, the sister of Chicago's most feared crime boss did not speak a single word. Not one. Not to the doctors who walked in clutching their leather briefcases and quietly withdrew. Not to the specialists brought in from distant cities. Not even to the brother whose every word made the entire underworld hold its breath. Damon Westcott could bring the strongest man to his knees with a single phone call. But he could not make his 19-year-old sister say one word. Then, one morning, a poor housekeeper walked through the gates of the estate. No beauty, no power, nothing but a pair of calloused hands and a past she kept buried. What happened next, no one in that mansion saw coming, least of all the man who believed he held everything in his grip, never realizing that he was the one about to be changed. If this story has touched you, please leave a like so we know you're still listening. Share it with someone you believe also needs to hear this story today. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the heart-touching stories we'll share in the next tellings. The top floor of the building by the Chicago harbor was sunk in the kind of silence that anyone who had ever stepped into it would remember forever. A silence that didn't exist because the room was empty, but because people were afraid to speak. Damon Westcott sat behind a dark wooden desk, dressed in a black coat, his face revealing nothing, both hands resting still on the tabletop as though he had the whole afternoon to wait. In front of him stood Frank Delaney, a large man long accustomed to using his fists to do his talking, now standing with both shoulders hunched. Beside him, a thin man named Harold Pike, the owner of a small shoe repair shop on the west side, sat curled on the edge of a chair, his trembling hands clutching an old hat. Walter Kane stood silently behind Damon, saying nothing, only giving a slight nod when his boss glanced his way. It was Walter who had brought Mr. Pike here. After hearing that Delaney had squeezed the debt so brutally, he'd taken even the last sewing machines from the shop. The only things that had kept the old man's family alive for 20 years. Damon didn't raise his voice. He'd never needed to raise his voice. He only looked at Delaney with eyes so calm they chilled the blood, then asked in a flat voice whether he had borrowed from him to do business, or to rob a man who had nothing left to lose. Delaney stammered something about interest, about rules, about how everyone had to pay their debts. Damon slowly stood. The entire room seemed to hold its breath with each step he took around the desk. He stopped in front of Delaney and lowered his voice until only a few people could hear. "I allowed you to make money in this city. I never allowed you to choke an old man just to take the food from his table." He turned to Harold Pike, and his voice softened, a gentleness that made the men standing in the room feel even more unsettled than when he had been cold. He said the machines would be back in his shop before dark, and from now on, no one would set foot in that neighborhood again. Mr. Pike lifted his head, his eyes red-rimmed, his lips moving, but no complete thank you could come out. Damon only gave a faint nod, as though to him, this wasn't kindness, but simply the only right thing that could be done. With Delaney, he didn't need to give any cruel order. He only said one sentence. "From this moment on, you no longer work under my name." And in Damon's world, losing that name was more frightening than any threat. Delaney went pale, because he understood exactly what it meant. 2 of Walter's men stepped forward, led him outside, and the door closed with a dry, hard sound. Nothing more than that. Nothing more was needed. That was the one principle all of Chicago knew about Damon Westcott. He could be ruthless with anyone who dared challenge him, could make an entire operation collapse after a single phone call, but he'd never, not even once, tolerate the strong crushing the weak. People whispered that the principle came from something in his past, a wound no one dared ask about, but no one knew for certain. They only knew one thing. Standing with those who bullied the helpless in front of Damon was the last mistake they would ever make. When everything was over, Walter handed him his coat and quietly said the car was waiting. Damon walked out of the building, slid into the back seat, and said nothing more for the entire ride home. The city slipped past outside the window, yellow light casting itself across his face, the face of a man at the height of power, a man no one dared oppose. Then the car turned onto the road leading up to the mansion on the hill, and something inside him went quiet. The iron gate opened, and the house rose before him, massive and solemn, its windows glowing with light. But the closer Damon came, the more he felt that familiar cold climb into his chest. He crossed the grand foyer, the sound of his shoes echoing over the stone floor, then stopped at the foot of the staircase and looked up toward the upstairs hall, where one door still remained shut and silent, just as it had for the past 3 years. He was the man the whole city feared, the man who could reclaim justice for a stranger in a single afternoon. And yet, Standing before the door to his sister's room, all that power suddenly became meaningless. That door had been closed since 3 years ago, on the night when everything in the Westcott family collapsed in a single moment. Damon still remembered that evening clearly. He had been in another city handling business. When Walter's call came through in a broken voice, Damon had never heard from that steady man before. His parents, who had long since left the underworld behind to live a peaceful life, had become the targets of a purge aimed at the Westcott name itself. Someone wanted to send Damon a message, and they had chosen the cruelest way to do it. He came home too late. All that remained was the silence inside a house that had once been filled with laughter, and a 16-year-old girl sitting curled up in the corner of the hallway, her eyes wide open and fixed on empty space, as though her mind had gone somewhere far away where no one could reach her. Sophie didn't cry. That was what frightened Damon most of all. She didn't scream, didn't call out for her parents, didn't do any of the things a child who had just lost her whole world should have done. She simply went silent, and from the next morning on, she never said another word. 3 years had passed since then, and Sophie's silence became the only thing in Damon's life that he couldn't buy, couldn't force, couldn't use power to change. She still ate when food was brought to her. She still sat by the window, staring out at the garden for hours. She still let Walter lead her on walks around the mansion grounds, but she lived like someone sinking beneath the surface of the water, seeing the world above through a fogged pane of glass, hearing every sound drift toward her from some faraway place, with no way to rise up and breathe. Damon had done everything a man with both fortune and power in his hands could do. He brought in the finest doctors, people who entered with leather briefcases and walked out after a few weeks with helpless shakes of the head. He brought psychologists from distant cities, some who stayed for an entire month, some who lasted only a few days, but all of them left with the same conclusion, that they couldn't reach the place where Sophie was hiding unless she herself wanted to come back. Some advised him to be patient. Some said she needed more time. Some told him bluntly that perhaps she would never speak again, and that sentence was the only thing that made Damon, a man who had never shown emotion in front of anyone, walk out of the room so no one could see his face at that moment. Every night, after returning from work that made the whole city tremble, he would stop before her bedroom door, lay his palm against the cold wood, and sometimes speak a few words into the silence behind it. He would tell her about an ordinary day, about the weather, about some small, meaningless thing, even though he knew there would be no answer. He never knocked hard. He never forced her to open the door, because he understood that whatever had pushed her beneath that water wasn't something an open door could heal. Walter had once told him that perhaps what Sophie needed wasn't a specialist, wasn't money, and wasn't any expensive method, but something far simpler that none of them had yet been able to name. Damon had only stood in silence then, looking out the window, because he was a man used to solving every problem with strength and decisiveness, and for the first time in his life, he was facing something that made every bit of strength he possessed useless. He could protect an entire empire. He could reclaim justice for strangers, but he couldn't pull his only sister back into life, and that helplessness gnawed at him every day, quiet and relentless. Behind the face the whole underworld believed nothing could ever shake. Finding someone to care for Sophie had never been a simple matter in a house like the Westcott home, because not everyone could walk through those gates, and even fewer people were allowed near the little sister Damon, guarded like the last precious thing he had left. Walter Kane was the one who handled it, and he did it the way he had done everything throughout his many years of service to the family, with care down to the smallest detail. Every person considered for a position inside the mansion was investigated thoroughly by him, from the place they were born, to the places they had worked, to the relationships even they themselves might have forgotten. Walter wasn't looking for the most impressive person. He was looking for the safest one. And that was why Rachel Brennan's file made him pause longer than the others. There was nothing outstanding about her in the way people usually expected. No glittering degree, no letters of recommendation from prestigious families. Only a 28-year-old woman who had passed through all kinds of cleaning jobs to make a living. But that very ordinariness was what reassured Walter, because in her background there wasn't a single thread leading to the underworld, not one suspicious name, not one empty space that made a person need to ask questions. She was clean in the sense that mattered to people like Walter, meaning she belonged to no one, owed no one a favor that could be exploited, and had no reason to pry into the secrets of this house. For a family in which every stranger who stepped inside could become a danger, a person with nothing to hide became the most trustworthy person of all, and that was why Walter decided to let her come. On the morning Rachel set foot inside the mansion, the house greeted her with a cold silence that even the sunlight pouring through the tall windows couldn't warm. She didn't stop to lift her head in amazement at the luxury, as Walter had seen so many others do before. She didn't let her eyes roam over the valuable things, didn't offer a flattering word of praise. She simply followed him through the long corridors, her hands resting still, the calloused hands of someone used to labor, and listened to his instructions with the calmness of a person who knew exactly why she had come. When Walter told her about Sophie, about the fact that the girl hadn't spoken for 3 years, Rachel didn't show curiosity, didn't ask what had happened, didn't look toward the upstairs hallway with the pitying eyes he had grown far too used to seeing. She only nodded, and the only thing she asked was what time Sophie usually woke up and what foods the girl liked to eat, as though to her, a person who didn't speak was still a person who needed to be treated normally, like anyone else. Damon watched all of it from the end of the hallway, not hiding himself, not disguised, standing there with the posture of a man who owned the house and everything inside it. He had seen too many people walk into this place, and he had learned how to read them within the first few minutes. Those who feared him, those who calculated what they might take from this house, those who pretended to be kind in order to win the master's favor. But this woman didn't belong to any of those kinds. She didn't glance his way to study him, didn't try to seem pleasant, didn't show the slightest trace of fear, though surely she knew whose house she was standing in. She only did exactly what she had come to do, and it was that calmness that made Damon keep his attention on her longer than he had intended. He didn't trust people easily, and he had already decided he would watch this new woman closely, not because he suspected anything specific, but because in his world, caution was the only thing that kept the people he loved safe. That caution drove Damon to seek Rachel out on the 3rd day after she arrived, not to greet her, but to test her the way he tested everyone who stepped into his life. He stopped her in the hallway while she was carrying a tray of food up to Sophie, blocking her path with a presence that could make grown men step back. He looked straight at her and asked in a flat voice so cold each word seemed to cut through the air, whether she knew whose house she was working in and how long she thought she would last here, before realizing she shouldn't be curious about things that had nothing to do with her. It was a threat wrapped inside a question, the kind of quiet pressure he used to see how a person would break, whether they would bow their head and apologize in a panic, or tremble and try to please him, or begin speaking lies. But Rachel did none of those things. She didn't set the tray down, didn't take a step back, and didn't avoid his eyes. She only looked back at him with calm eyes and answered that she knew very well who she was working for, and that was exactly why she had come here to care for his sister, not to pry into anything. She said she had lived long enough to understand that other people's secrets weren't the kind of thing that put more food on her table, and if he had hired her, then he should let her work, and if he didn't trust her, then he was free to send her away. But she wouldn't stand there proving her honesty by being afraid. The whole hallway sank into silence after that sentence. Damon was used to people being terrified of him, and that terror was so natural to him that he had almost forgotten there were still people who wouldn't be conquered by it. He looked at her for a while longer, searching for some sign of pretense, of borrowed courage, but he found nothing except the tired honesty of a woman who had been through too much hardship to have any strength left for empty threats. In the end, he only stepped aside, letting her pass, and said nothing more. But something in his eyes had changed, a reluctant recognition for the woman who had dared to stand upright in front of him. Rachel continued up the stairs as though nothing had happened, and began her work in a way no expensive specialist before her had ever done. She didn't try to force Sophie to react, didn't ask questions that waited for answers, and didn't look at the girl with the eyes of someone who had come to cure an illness. She simply stepped into the room, set the food tray down, then quietly did the small things that needed doing, drawing the curtains so the light could pour in, straightening a few books, and now and then saying a few stray words about an ordinary day, without expecting Sophie to answer. She sat down in the chair beside the window, leaving just enough distance between herself and the girl so Sophie wouldn't feel invaded, and she simply sat there in silence, a silence that wasn't awkward, wasn't heavy, but steady and peaceful, as though she understood that sometimes what a person needed most wasn't words, but the presence of another human being beside them. Sophie didn't look at her, still keeping her eyes fixed on the empty space beyond the window as she did every day. But the girl didn't seem upset either, didn't turn away, didn't fold into herself the way she always did with other strangers. Rachel noticed that, and she didn't hurry, because deep inside, She knew exactly the place where Sophie was hiding, that feeling of sinking beneath something so heavy that you no longer wanted to rise to the surface. She had once sat beside someone drowned in grief like that. She had once learned that you couldn't pull someone up by force, that all you could do was stay long enough for them to understand they weren't alone, and that buried memory was what guided every quiet thing she did in that room. The days that followed passed in a rhythm the entire mansion slowly grew used to. Rachel went up to Sophie's room every morning, did her quiet work, sat by the window for a while, then left. She didn't push, didn't expect anything, only kept showing up steadily, as naturally as sunlight entering a room that had once been closed off from the whole world. She began bringing small things with her, a cup of warm tea placed beside Sophie's hand without a word, a flower cut from the garden and set in the vase on the table, an old book she left open in the middle and then abandoned there as though she had forgotten it by accident. She never asked whether Sophie liked any of it, never waited for a nod, only did these things and left, day after day, patient in the way of someone who wasn't waiting for a reward. And then, one morning, when Rachel stepped into the room to clear away the food tray from the day before, she stopped still. On the table, beside the cup of tea that had gone cold, there was a small piece of paper folded carefully. She picked it up, opened it, and saw a few trembling handwritten words, the handwriting of someone who hadn't held a pen in a long time, uneven but clear, only one brief line saying, "Thank you for yesterday's flower." Rachel stood silent for a moment, her fingers tightening gently around the paper, and when she lifted her eyes, she found Sophie looking at her. For the first time, the girl was looking directly into her eyes instead of staring out the window. A hesitant and cautious gaze, like that of a child who had just opened the smallest crack in a door she had kept locked for a lifetime. Rachel didn't cry out, didn't rush toward her, didn't do anything that might shatter that fragile moment. She only smiled very softly, folded the paper again as though it were the most precious thing she had ever been given, and said quietly that tomorrow she would bring another flower. Then she went on with her work as if nothing had happened, because she understood that what Sophie needed now wasn't noisy attention, but the safety of knowing she could take one small step forward without anyone seizing hold of her. Damon witnessed all of it from the doorway. He had gone upstairs to ask Walter about something, and stopped in the hallway when he saw the scene inside the room where, for the past 3 years, he had only dared to stand outside. He saw the paper in that woman's hand, saw his sister's eyes lift, saw something that he himself, with all his money and all his power, hadn't been able to create even once through those long and endless years. The man who could make an entire city hold its breath with a single look now stood there motionless, his throat tight, and for the first time in a very long while, he felt something break open inside his chest, something that felt like joy and pain at the same time. Joy because his sister had taken one step toward the light, and pain because the person who had made that possible wasn't him. He didn't go in, didn't speak, didn't break the moment. He only stepped back, leaned against the wall in the hallway, and stood there in silence for a very long time, letting the emotions he had buried for so many years rise and then settle. When Rachel came out of the room, she found him standing there, and in the instant their eyes met, she realized the man before her was no longer the cold boss who had stopped her in the hallway days earlier. He was an older brother, and in his eyes there was something she had never seen before, a silent gratitude he didn't know how to put into words, and perhaps didn't need to, because they both understood that something in this house had just begun to change. That evening, after returning to the small room for the household staff at the end of the wing, Rachel sat on the edge of the bed and took out Sophie's note to look at it one more time, and those trembling lines pulled her back to a chapter of life she had always tried to keep buried deep inside her heart. She understood Sophie's silence not because she had read about it in books, but because she had once lived beside it, had once been the person who stayed when everyone else had turned away and left. Many years earlier, when Rachel was still very young, her mother fell ill, a long, lingering sickness that gnawed away at her little by little, turning a woman who had once been strong and full of life into a shadow lying motionless in a hospital bed. Her father had left long ago. There was no one else in the family, and so the burden of caring for her mother fell entirely on the shoulders of a girl who hadn't even had time to grow up. Rachel gave up everything a young person should have had, the dreams, the chances, the years that should have belonged to her alone, so she could sit beside that sickbed day after day. She learned how to change bandages, how to feed her mother one spoonful of porridge at a time, how to wash her body, how to hear in each breath whether that night would be a difficult one. But the hardest part wasn't any of those tasks. It was the long stretches of time when her mother no longer had the strength to speak, and only lay there staring at the ceiling with empty eyes, lost in some place Rachel couldn't reach. She had sat beside her mother through those endless silences, not knowing what else to do except hold that thin hand and stay, simply stay, so her mother would know that no matter where she had sunk, there was still someone here, waiting for her if she wanted to come back. That was when Rachel learned the lesson that would later guide her in Sophie's room, that there are kinds of pain that can't be healed with comforting words, can't be driven away by urging, and can only be soothed by the steady presence of someone willing to sit in the darkness with you. Her mother passed away on a quiet morning, as silently as she had lived through the final months of her life, and Rachel stayed beside her until the last breath, holding her hand until that hand went cold. But the grief of losing her mother wasn't the only thing she left behind. The years of treatment had swallowed every dollar Rachel had saved, and more than that, they left a crushing medical debt on the shoulders of a young woman who had no one left to lean on. Rachel walked out of her mother's funeral with empty hands and a debt larger than anything she could earn in many years. And from that day on, her life became a long chain of cleaning jobs, one after another, working until her hands grew calloused and cracked, living frugally on every dollar, moving from one place to the next, just to slowly pay down the debt that illness and death had left behind. She had never blamed her mother for any of it, because to Rachel, being with her until the final moment was worth more than any amount of money. But those lonely years of carrying everything alone had forged her into a woman who could remain calm before any threat, who was no longer easily knocked down by fear, and who carried within her a deep understanding of people who were sinking. When she sat beside Sophie and watched the girl drift into the emptiness beyond the window, she didn't see a case that needed to be cured. She saw herself from all those years ago, sitting beside someone she loved, as that person slowly slipped farther away, and she knew exactly what she had to do. Not pull the girl up, but stay long enough for her to know she wasn't alone. That debt, the thing that had followed Rachel through all those lonely years, turned out not to have released her even when she thought she had found a place of peace inside the Westcott mansion. One afternoon, when she went out to the side gate to receive several boxes of supplies for the kitchen, an unfamiliar car pulled up by the road, and from inside it stepped a man whose face alone was enough to make her heart tighten. Carl Voss was the man who had bought her debt years ago, a man who made his living gathering up the debts of desperate people and squeezing them down to the bone. And now he had come here with the crooked smile of someone who knew he held another person's weakness in his hand. He blocked Rachel's path, his voice sugary and full of threat, saying he had gone to great trouble searching for her everywhere, that her debt had swollen terribly because the interest kept breeding more interest, and that a hired woman working in a wealthy house like this must surely have some way to find the money to pay him. Rachel stepped back, trying to keep her voice steady, and said she was still paying gradually as they had agreed, and he had no right to come all the way to her workplace to cause trouble. But Voss only laughed, moved closer, and lowered his voice, saying that if she couldn't arrange it, then perhaps her employer would find it very interesting to hear a few things he could tell him about her past. Then he hinted that she'd better be sensible, that her presence in this house wasn't nearly as accidental as she thought. As he spoke, he reached out and grabbed her wrist, and in that very instant, a voice rose from behind them, deep and so cold the whole garden seemed to freeze. Damon stood there, though no one knew how long he had been watching, and one question from him, asking who had given this man permission to put his hand on a woman working in his house, was enough to make Voss's hand drop, as though it had been burned. He turned around, and the color in his face changed the moment he realized who was standing before him. Damon walked toward him one slow step at a time, not rushing, not raising his voice, but every footstep made Voss back away until his spine struck the side of the car. Damon didn't need to use force in the way ordinary men imagined power. He only stood close, looked straight into Voss's eyes, and said in a flat voice that he had 3 seconds to explain why he had dared come to Damon's doorstep to threaten a woman. Voss stammered, his earlier arrogance vanishing without a trace, and in his panic, he blurted out that he had only been following orders, that he hadn't wanted to come here on his own, that someone had paid him to find Rachel and pry into this house. The moment those words left his mouth, Voss realized he had said too much, and he went silent, his face turning deathly white. Damon didn't miss it. His eyes narrowed, and for a moment the whole space seemed to sink beneath the weight of what had just been revealed. But he didn't question him further right then. He only signaled to 2 of Walter's men, who had just arrived, and Voss was put into a car and taken away without daring to make a sound, because he understood that his fate now rested entirely in the hands of the man the whole city feared. When the car disappeared beyond the gate, Damon turned to Rachel, and for the first time, his voice lost its usual coldness. He asked if she was hurt, and when she gave a small shake of her head, he said that from now on, no one would be able to come here and trouble her again, that the debt was no longer something she had to carry alone. Rachel lifted her eyes to him, her throat tightening, because it had been so long since anyone had stood between her and harm like that. And in that moment, something between them quietly shifted. But behind that relief, inside Damon's mind, the words Voss had blurted out kept echoing without end, because he knew very well that a man like him would never devise a scheme like this on his own, and that somewhere in the darkness, another hand was pulling the strings, one whose face Damon had not yet seen. That invisible hand in the darkness didn't make Damon wait long before striking again, and this time it aimed straight at the most fragile thing Rachel still had left, her dignity. Only a few days after Voss was taken away, a rumor began to creep through the mansion. At first only whispers among the servants, then spreading wider until it reached Damon's ears through a source that seemed trustworthy. People said several valuable items in the house had disappeared, an antique watch, a few pieces of jewelry kept in the storage room, and that those things had gone missing at exactly the time Rachel had come to work there. Someone even insisted they had seen her lingering near the place where those precious objects were kept, and the accusation had been built so carefully that every detail fit together, as though it had all been arranged in advance. The air inside the mansion immediately grew tense. Suspicious eyes began turning toward Rachel. Murmurs died the moment she walked past, and she could feel the weight of doubt pressing down on her shoulders. Even though no one had said a single word to her face, Damon stood in the middle of that storm with a choice he had never thought he would have to face. One part of him, the part that had lived too long in a world where betrayal came from the most unexpected places, whispered that he shouldn't trust someone who had only just arrived, that perhaps the accusations weren't baseless, that he had been too quick to let a stranger come near his sister. But the other part of him, the part that had seen that woman stand straight in front of him, without trembling, had watched her sit beside Sophie, with a patience that asked for nothing in return, had seen the first note from his sister after 3 years, knew that something in this whole story didn't fit. He was not a man who ever made decisions based on feeling, and instead of condemning Rachel because of a rumor, he chose to find the truth himself. He quietly had his people examine the entire matter again, checking who had first released the rumor. Following the details, the person behind it had assumed no one would notice, and the deeper he dug, the more he realized the pieces had been arranged too perfectly to be true, that some hand had worked very hard to stage this entire performance in order to drive Rachel out of the house. While Damon investigated in silence, Rachel had to bear the weight of those mistrustful eyes alone. And for a woman who had spent her whole life holding on to honesty as her last possession, nothing was more painful than being suspected of being a thief. She didn't defend herself, didn't shout and demand that people believe her, because she had learned long ago that words carried no weight against judgments already formed. But when night came, sitting alone in her small room, she quietly packed her few belongings into her old bag, her heart heavy with a familiar shame, the feeling of someone who, no matter how hard she tried, would never be allowed to belong in any decent place. She thought about leaving before she was thrown out, so she could keep the last small piece of her self-respect, so she wouldn't have to stand there and hear someone declare her a thief in front of everyone. She thought of Sophie, of the small note, of the quiet mornings by the window, and her heart twisted painfully at the thought that perhaps she would have to leave the girl halfway through. But she told herself that someone like her had never had the right to dream of anything lasting, and that perhaps leaving quietly was the best thing she could do. The next morning, while dew still clung to the window frames and most of the mansion had not yet awakened, Rachel slung her old bag over her shoulder and quietly walked down the stairs, intending to leave before anyone had the chance to see her. She had decided not to say goodbye to anyone, not to leave a single word behind, because she thought that a woman suspected of being a thief had no right to offer a proper farewell. But when she passed the foot of the staircase leading up to the upstairs hallway, she froze. Sophie was standing there, at the top of the stairs, still in her nightclothes, her hair tangled and her eyes red as though she had been awake all night. No one knew how she had learned that Rachel was about to leave. Perhaps the whispers in the house had slipped even into her closed room. But what stunned Rachel wasn't the girl's presence. It was the way Sophie hurried down the steps, something she hadn't done for anyone in 3 years. Sophie ran to stand in front of her, blocking her path, and stood there breathing hard, both hands clenched tightly together. Then she reached out, opened her palm, and inside it was the small piece of paper Rachel had given back to her. The first note with the line thanking her for the flower, carefully preserved by Sophie all these days. She held it out like a wordless plea, her tear-filled eyes looking straight at Rachel, and in that gaze was everything she couldn't say. A plea not to go, a fear of being left behind once more, a desperate clinging to the only person who had patiently stayed beside her when the whole world had turned away. Rachel knelt down to the girl's level and felt her throat tighten. She looked at the paper in Sophie's hand, looked at the trembling fingers, gripping it as though it were the most precious thing in the world. And every argument about self-respect, about leaving to make things easier, about how someone like her had no right to belong anywhere, all of it suddenly dissolved before that gaze. Sophie didn't need to know what people were saying about her. She didn't care about the accusations. She didn't concern herself with whether Rachel was a thief or not. To Sophie, Rachel was simply the person who had stayed. And now the girl was using all the strength of a soul that had only just begun to open, in order to keep her there. Rachel gently placed her hand over the girl's hand, holding the paper, and said in a voice so soft it almost broke that she wasn't going anywhere, that she was sorry she had almost left her behind, and that no matter what happened, she would be here with her. When Sophie heard that, her tense shoulders suddenly loosened, and then she did something that made Rachel unable to hold back her tears. She stepped forward and threw her arms around Rachel, holding her tightly like a child who had found again something she thought she had lost. Rachel embraced the girl, soothing the small back that trembled faintly beneath her hand, and in that moment she understood that between two women who had both known what it meant to sink inside grief, a bond had formed that no slander could cut apart. She slipped the bag from her shoulder, let it fall onto the stair, and decided to stay. Not because anyone had proven her innocent, but because someone needed her to stay, and that reason was greater than all the rumors outside that room. She didn't know that the decision to remain would bring her into the center of a much larger storm, a storm in which those false accusations were only the first wind of warning. While Rachel chose to stay, Damon quietly followed every thread of the staged accusation, and what he found slowly revealed a truth that chilled him to the bone. He began with the simplest question: who had been the first to release the rumor that Rachel had stolen from the house? And he traced it through contradictory statements, through evasive eyes, until every mark led back to one single name: a man named Russell Hart, someone who had worked in the Westcott household for many years, and whom Damon had trusted with overseeing part of the mansion's affairs. Damon had him summoned, and under his employer's ice-cold stare, Russell's calm facade quickly began to crack. He twisted his words and denied everything. But when Damon placed before him the evidence he had gathered, the secret meetings, the strange sums of money transferred into his account, he finally collapsed and confessed. Russell admitted that he had been bribed, that someone had paid him a large amount of money to create the story that Rachel had stolen from the house in order to sow distrust and distract Damon. And when Damon asked who was behind it, the name that came out of Russell's mouth seemed to freeze the entire room: Silas Holloway. To Damon, that name wasn't only the name of a rival boss controlling the northern part of the city, a man who had long coveted his territory. It was an old wound he had buried deep for 3 years. Because Silas Holloway was the man who had stood behind the purge all those years ago. The man who had ordered the attack on Damon's parents to send him a message. The man who had turned Sophie from a girl full of life into a silent young woman for 3 long years. Damon had spent a great deal of time and effort trying to find the true mastermind behind that terrible night. But Holloway was an old fox, always hiding behind layer after layer of cover, never leaving behind a trace clear enough for Damon to strike. And now, through the confession of a traitor inside his own house, all the scattered pieces from all this time suddenly fitted together into a complete and terrifying picture. Damon realized that Rachel's appearance in his life hadn't been accidental, the way Walter had believed when he hired her. Holloway had been watching him for a long time, had known he was searching for someone to care for Sophie, and had already laid a delicate trap. Carl Voss, the man who held Rachel's debt, was in truth only a pawn Holloway had planted ahead of time, used to manipulate her, to turn her into a path of access into Damon's closely guarded mansion. Holloway's plan had been to use Rachel as a crack, a weakness through which he could slip into Damon's world. But there was one thing he hadn't foreseen, that the woman he had chosen as a pawn would be the only person able to touch Sophie's frozen heart. and that instead of becoming a weakness, she would become the very thing that brought the Westcott family closer together than ever before. When the full truth came to light, Damon sat in silence in the dark room, and for the first time in 3 years, the flame of hatred he had thought had gone cold flared again inside his chest. But this time, it was no longer the blind rage of a man who had just lost everything. It was the cold, sharpened resolve of a man who knew exactly who his enemy was. He understood that Holloway wouldn't stop after the false accusation failed, that he would keep searching for another way, and that Rachel, the innocent woman who had been dragged into this war without knowing it, was now in far greater danger than she imagined. He called Walter to him, the only person in the house he knew he could trust completely, and began to prepare, because he knew the real storm had only just begun to roll in. The storm Damon feared came faster than he had expected, and it struck at the very place where he hadn't had time to guard himself. One afternoon, when Rachel went to the nearby market to buy a few things for the kitchen at Walter's request, a group of Holloway's men blocked her in the middle of the crowded street, and before she could understand what was happening, they had forced her into a car and sped away until they vanished. The news crashed back into the mansion like a knife, and when Walter told Damon, he stood frozen for a moment, his face, which never revealed emotion, going pale with a fear he hadn't felt since the night he lost his parents. Before long, a call from Holloway confirmed what he had already suspected. The rival boss's voice rang out with triumph, saying he had Rachel in his hands, and that if Damon wanted her returned safely, he would have to surrender all the territory and control he had spent so long building. Holloway knew exactly what he was doing. He had guessed that the woman now meant far more to Damon than a servant in his house, and he used her as the final card to force his enemy to his knees, the one thing he hadn't been able to do 3 years earlier. Damon stood before a choice he had never thought he would face in his life. On one side was the empire he had built with his youth, his blood, and his lonely years, the thing that had become his very identity. On the other side was the woman who had entered his life quietly, who had done what all his money and power couldn't do, who had drawn his sister back toward the light and warmed this cold house from within. But for Damon, it had never truly been the difficult choice Holloway imagined. He had once lost the people he loved because he hadn't arrived in time, and he swore he would never let that happen again, even if the price was everything he possessed. Meanwhile, in the place where she was being held, Rachel didn't collapse the way Holloway expected her to. She was afraid, of course. Her heart pounded, and her hands went cold. But she had passed through too much pain in her life not to know that panic wouldn't help her. She kept herself calm, sat quietly, and observed everything around her, remembered the number of guards, watched the way they came and went, and listened to every scrap of conversation they accidentally let slip. She worked out where the room holding her was located through the sounds echoing from outside, noticed that one of the guards often lost focus at certain times, and silently remembered it all, waiting for even the smallest chance. When Holloway came to see her and speak in his victorious tone, he said she was only a cheap pawn, that from the beginning she had never been anything more than a tool for him to get what he wanted. But Rachel lifted her head and looked straight at him, and instead of begging the way he expected, she said calmly that he was wrong to think taking her would make Damon weaker, because he didn't understand that some people, when driven to the end of the road, only became stronger, and that he would soon realize he had angered exactly the man he should have stayed far away from. That steady answer made the smile on Holloway's face falter for a brief moment, because he was used to people falling to their knees and pleading, not an empty-handed woman looking at him with eyes that refused to yield. And while he was still startled, Rachel quietly kept watching, remembering, and waiting, because she knew that somewhere out there, the man who had promised never to let her stand alone was already on his way to find her. Inside the mansion, the air was stretched tight like a thread about to snap, and Sophie could feel it even though no one told her directly what was happening. She saw the servants hurrying back and forth with frightened faces, saw her brother coming and going, with an expression she hadn't seen since that fateful night 3 years ago, and with the sensitivity of someone who had grown used to watching the world in silence, she understood that something terrible had happened to Rachel. She stood at the top of the staircase, listening to scraps of conversation drifting up from downstairs, and when she heard Walter quietly tell someone that they were holding her and still didn't know what the situation was, a cold fear rose inside her chest. It was a fear she knew too well, the fear of someone about to lose a loved one all over again, the fear that had pushed her beneath a sheet of silent ice for 3 long years. But this time, something was different. This time, The person about to be taken from her was the one who had patiently sat beside her every morning, the one who had given her the first flower, the one who had promised she wouldn't leave her behind, and had kept that promise. And the thought that she might lose Rachel, that she might have to return to that empty room with no one sitting by the window beside her, did what 3 years of therapy and money had never been able to do. It pulled her up through the surface of the water. Just as Damon was putting on his coat and striding quickly toward the foyer to leave, a sound rang out from the staircase, making everyone in the hall freeze as though turned to stone. It was Sophie's voice, hoarse and broken because it hadn't been used for so long, but clear and unmistakable, calling her brother's name. She stood at the top of the stairs, both hands gripping the railing, tears streaming down her face, and she called him again, begging him to bring Rachel home, begging him not to let her be taken away the way their parents had been long ago. Damon spun around, and in that instant, the man the whole city feared stood, rooted in the middle of the foyer, unable to believe what he had heard. For 3 years, he had waited to hear that voice. He had given up so much just for the hope that his sister might speak again, even a single word, and now it rang out, not in a therapy session, not after some expensive treatment, but bursting from her heart because she was afraid of losing someone she loved. He stepped toward her, took his sister into his arms, and for the first time in many years, he felt his eyes burn. Sophie sobbed against him, repeating again and again her plea for him to save Rachel, and every sound of her voice seemed to tear his chest open while giving him a strength he had never known before. He held her tighter one more time, then lifted her tear-soaked face, looked straight into her eyes, and promised in a firm voice that he would bring Rachel back, that he wouldn't let her lose anyone else, that this time he wouldn't arrive too late. Walter stood nearby, the steady man who had witnessed this family from its brightest days to its darkest night, and even he had to turn his face away to hide his emotion. And when Damon walked out the door, rushing into the night to find the woman who had brought his sister's heart back to life, he carried with him not only the resolve of a man going to save the woman he loved, but also his sister's first call after 3 years, a call that had become a reminder that this time, he wasn't allowed to fail. Damon didn't rush toward Holloway like a man driven mad by rage, because he understood that recklessness was exactly what his enemy wanted most from him. He had spent the hours before that preparing with cold, meticulous care, calling in the most loyal people under his command, tracing the place where Holloway was holding Rachel through the information network he had built over many years, and laying out a plan that left no opening behind. Holloway had chosen an old abandoned warehouse on the edge of the city as the place to keep her, believing its difficult location and the large number of guards would be enough to keep him in control, but he had forgotten that Damon Westcott hadn't climbed to the height of power by luck. When night fell, Damon's people moved in silently from several directions, disabling each layer of security cleanly and quietly, cutting off Holloway's lines of communication before he had time to realize what was happening. Inside, Rachel began to hear unusual sounds rising around her, and she understood at once that the moment she had been waiting for had arrived. She had watched long enough to know when the guard outside her room usually became careless, and when the chaos outside pulled his attention away, she used that instant to free herself in part, making things easier when the rescuers appeared. Damon was the first one to burst into the room where she was being held, and when their eyes met amid the chaos, both of them read in each other's gaze everything that didn't need to be said. He moved quickly to her, pulled her behind him to shield her, and only had time to ask whether she was hurt before Holloway appeared at the far end of the room. The two men stood facing each other, enemies who had haunted one another for 3 long years, and in that instant, everything between them settled into a heavy stillness. Holloway still tried to hold on to his arrogance, throwing out a challenge that Damon wouldn't dare touch him, that if he fell, the entire underworld would sink into chaos, but Damon was no longer interested in listening to those words. He looked straight at the man who had taken his parents from him, the man who had pushed his sister into 3 years of silence, the man who had just dared lay hands on the woman he loved, and he said in a voice so calm, it was terrifying that Holloway had made the greatest mistake of his life when he thought he could use the people Damon loved as cards to bargain with. The confrontation was swift and decisive. Holloway's men, already overwhelmed and shaken, couldn't withstand Damon's careful preparation, and before long, the entire balance had tilted completely in his favor. Holloway, realizing there was no way out, still tried to struggle in desperation, but Damon subdued him, ending the danger that had haunted his family for so many years, closing the blood feud without letting it drag him down into becoming a man like Holloway. He handed him over to justice in his own way, making certain that this man would never be able to harm anyone again, then turned his back on him. Because to Damon, the most important thing in that moment wasn't victory or revenge, but the woman standing behind him. When everything was over, Damon turned to Rachel, and every trace of the cold crime lord vanished from his face. He lifted his hand and cradled her face with care, asking again and again if she was truly all right. And Rachel, who had forced herself to stay strong through the entire time she had been held, finally let her shoulders tremble and leaned into his arms. In that old warehouse, amid the wreckage of a plot that had just collapsed, two people who had once believed they would be lonely forever held each other, and Damon whispered into her hair that he was taking her home, back to the place where someone was waiting for them both, and that from now on, no one would ever be able to separate the people who belonged together. Ending the feud with Holloway didn't turn Damon into a different man overnight, because he understood that an empire built over so many years couldn't be dismantled in an instant, and the people who lived by it also needed a road forward. But something inside him had changed. A quiet but certain shift that began the moment he heard his sister's first call and saw the fear in the eyes of the woman he loved. He began slowly pulling back from the darkest boundaries of the underworld, handing the most dangerous parts of the work over to others, and step by step, redirecting his vast fortune toward legitimate business under the light of day. He didn't announce it to anyone with beautiful words. He simply did it quietly, the way he did everything, decisively and without display. Walter, who had stood beside him through the darkest years, was the first to notice that change, and in the old butler's eyes there was a silent relief, as though he had been waiting for this day for a very long time. One of the first things Damon did in his new position was establish a fund to help people who had been trampled by life the way Rachel had. People carrying debts on their shoulders that weren't their fault, people driven to the end of the road by illness and loss, people who only needed a hand reaching out at the right moment so they could stand again. He entrusted Rachel with building that fund beside him, because no one understood the pain of those people better than she did, and also because he wanted the woman who had once carried everything alone in silence to see the kindness she had always kept in her heart grow into something larger. Rachel accepted that work with her whole heart, and for the first time in her life, her calloused hands were no longer only for cleaning up after other people, but for building something that belonged to her, something that could change the lives of those who had suffered as she had. One afternoon, when the fund held a small gathering for the families it had helped, the mansion garden rang with laughter for the first time in years. The children from those families ran across the grass and played under the warm sunlight, their bright laughter spreading through a space that had once been so cold. Sophie, now slowly returning to life, sat among the children and smiled as she watched them play, her face glowing in a way Damon had no longer dared hope he would ever see again. He stood at a distance and watched it all, Rachel beside the children handing out small gifts, his sister joining in their joy, and for the first time he felt that this house was no longer a cold fortress he had built to defend himself, but a true home. He realized that all the power he had once pursued, everything he had once believed was strength, couldn't compare with the simple peace of seeing the people he loved happy. Rachel lifted her eyes and caught his gaze from across the garden, and she smiled at him, a smile that no longer carried any shadow of the past. In that moment, Damon understood that the road he was walking, though still long and not always easy, was the only road worth taking, because it led him to a place where, for the first time in his life, he truly wanted to belong. In the corner of the mansion's great sitting room stood a piano that had gathered dust for 3 years. The same piano Damon and Sophie's mother used to play on peaceful evenings back when the family was still whole, and ever since that fateful night, no one in the house had dared touch it, leaving it standing silently in the corner like a memorial to everything they had lost. One evening, as the sunset poured through the tall windows and washed the entire room in gold, Sophie slowly walked over to the piano. Rachel and Damon were sitting nearby, and both of them fell silent when they saw the girl stop in front of it, gently brush away the layer of dust on the lid, and then sit down on the bench where her mother had once sat. No one dared speak, no one dared move, as though a single deep breath might shatter that fragile moment. Sophie placed her trembling fingers on the keys, hesitated for a brief moment, and then began to play. The first notes came out uncertain and broken, the playing of someone who hadn't touched a piano in far too long. But little by little, each note that followed grew steadier, smoother, until a whole melody rang out through the room, a piece of music she had perhaps once learned from her mother in those distant days. Damon sat completely still, and Rachel saw that the eyes of the man who had once made the whole city tremble were now shining with tears, because this was a sound he had no longer dared dream he would ever hear again, the sound of his sister playing, alive and full of feeling, as though those 3 silent years had only been a long dream from which she had finally awakened. The song came to a close on a low, lingering note that faded into silence, and in that sacred stillness, Sophie turned to look at her brother and Rachel, her eyes bright with a gentle smile. Damon rose to his feet and walked over to Rachel, and before the eyes of the 2 most important women in his life, he did the thing he had held in his heart for so long. He hadn't prepared beautiful speeches, hadn't arranged some elaborate setting, because he knew that between him and her, none of those things were needed. He simply took her calloused hand, the hand that had cleaned so many houses, had cared for a sick mother until her final breath, had sat patiently beside his sister every morning, and he told her, with complete sincerity, that she had entered this house as a stranger, and had become the light that both he and Sophie hadn't even known they had been longing for so desperately, that he couldn't imagine the rest of his life without her. And he asked whether she wanted to stay by his side, not as a servant in the house anymore, but as his life partner, forever. Rachel looked at him, her eyes blurred with tears, and before she could even find her voice, a clear young voice rang out from the piano. Sophie, with a radiant smile on her tear-stained face, softly said, "Mother would have liked her." Those simple words made both Damon and Rachel turn to look at her, and then all 3 of them laughed through their tears, a laughter woven from happiness and remembrance, from the joy of the present and the comfort of the past. Rachel stepped forward and wrapped her arms around both brother and sister, and in that embrace, 3 people who had carried wounds they once thought would never heal found a home in one another. Outside, the city of Chicago still glittered with light as it did every night, but in that small room, beneath the last glow of sunset, and beside the piano that had just been awakened, a new family was born, not through blood, but through patience, kindness, and a love that had healed everything. Many months later, the mansion on the hill was no longer the cold place people passed through while barely daring to breathe, but had become a home filled with laughter and light. Damon Westcott, the man who had once believed power was measured by the fear he could sow in others, now understood something that all those years sitting at the top of the underworld had never taught him. He realized that a person's true strength doesn't lie in the ability to force others to their knees, doesn't lie in wealth or authority, but in daring to stay beside someone who is suffering, daring to listen to their silence, and daring to stand up to protect the dignity of the weak when no one else is willing to do it. It was a poor housemaid with calloused hands, a woman with no power and no fortune in her grasp, who taught that lesson to the most powerful boss in Chicago, because she had done what all his money couldn't do. She had healed a heart that seemed to have frozen forever, simply through patience and kindness. The story of Rachel, Damon, and Sophie reminds us that the deepest wounds aren't healed by haste or expensive solutions, but by the steady presence of someone willing to stay. Sometimes, the greatest gift we can give a person sinking in darkness isn't advice or pity, but simply sitting beside them long enough for them to know they're not alone. And it also reminds us that kindness, even when it comes from an ordinary person with little money and little standing, still has the power to change lives that once seemed impossible to move, because a person's worth has never been measured by what they own, but by how they treat the people around them. If this story has touched your heart, please leave a like so we know you're still listening with us. Share it with someone you believe also needs to hear this story today, because sometimes the right story at the right moment can warm a soul in need. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the heartfelt stories we'll tell in the future. We'd truly love to know how this story made you feel, and what part of Rachel and Damon's journey moved you the most. So please leave a comment and share the feelings from deep inside your heart, because every line you share is precious encouragement for us to keep bringing you more meaningful stories each day. Thank you for spending your time listening all the way to the very last moment. May you, the person watching this video, always have abundant health, a joyful life, peace of mind, and calm in every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next stories.